Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and what I've got here in front of me is one of the two trays that I plan to feed today. It's one of my red wiggler systems, and I'm not sure if the camera's picking it up, but just from picking the box up and bringing it over to my bench, it seems like I've disturbed some of the inhabitants of the bin, and the inhabitants that I'm referring to are these little tiny mites running all over the place on the edge of the bin, and it's because of them too that I wanted to get into this box and provide the system with a feeding, not so much because I believe that it needs food so desperately, but maybe more because over the past few days, I've been treating all of my systems with this stuff right here, neem cake. The packaging doesn't say neem cake, it says neem meal or neem seed meal. And evidently this stuff really works well against reducing the number of mites in your systems. So even though after only 8 days, this system might not be too desperately in need of some food, I'm coming in here anyway to apply a little bit of food. And you know, I've got to admit, I did take a peek in here earlier, and I was a little bit concerned because the two systems that I want to feed, I did peek under the covers in both of them. And in the other one that we're going to feed after this, I could see all worms hanging out on the top surface, but none here. I could see a dead worm there, I could see a dead worm there. And I might be a little bit paranoid, or maybe even overly paranoid, on the topic of worm populations dying out in my systems, because I've had it happen. I've had it happen on a couple occasions now. And it did seem like in the one that it occurred in most recently, I had a huge population explosion of mites, and I've chalked that up to the fact that those mites probably ate all the dead worms that died in the systems where I saw the huge numbers of mites. So just the initial impulse of looking in here and spotting a whole bunch of mites, and now also seeing a number of dead worms, it's starting to make me wonder, am I in for more of the same type of fun here as I've been experiencing in some of my other systems? And I really don't know what's going on. I'm starting to grow suspicious that I might have some sort of a plague or some sort of a virus or illness going on. Because look at this. This system should have thousands of worms running around within it, and I don't see any yet. I mean, okay, we're getting down deep and we're spotting a couple now. And we were just in here not very long ago. You know, if you're a regular on my channel, you recognize this as the system that I've got the pine cones and the beach towel in. It's kind of like an experimental system. And this bin was quite busy. There were lots of worms in here. And I don't know if just over the past, I don't even know, 8 days since we last checked in here, is it possible that in such a short period of time I could have just a huge die out of worms? And then as a result of that, have a huge explosion in the population of mites because they're just feeding on all the dead worm carcasses? That's kind of been my theory lately as far as why I've observed huge mite populations in a couple of my systems. It's not just because the mites are suddenly, you know, entering some sort of a breeding season or something. To me, it seems like it's triggered by them having an abundance of food caused by a die out of worms. And I mean, you got to admit, this system has a couple worms in it, but certainly nothing compared to what it had maybe a week or so ago. And I'm doubting that it's got anything to do with me just not having arrived at the spot where all the worms are yet. I mean, yeah, okay, here we are, we're finding a couple here and there, but this is the feeding area where we last placed food into this system, and you would think that there'd be lots and lots of worms hanging out in here, but there's hardly any. Even here on top of this banana peel, which should feel kind of gooey and moist, but it feels actually kind of dry almost. Weird. Some people have talked about like certain types of bad bacteria running amok in their bins or that, you know, maybe not in their bins, but they, I guess, were knowledgeable enough to know that certain types of bacteria will just start going haywire within a bin and gobbling up all the available moisture and, you know, resulting in sort of dry, clumpy material within the bin. And I'm starting to wonder if that's possibly what's occurring here in this system too. And I thought I was over this whole situation where I was, you know, dealing with sick bins with populations in them that were dying off. In fact, it was just the other day that I went into one of my systems to manually pick out every single worm that I could still find to try to more or less rescue them and relocate them into a different system. And it almost seems like I'm on the brink of having a similar situation occur here. You know, this is just becoming a little bit frustrating, I gotta say. You know, I came down here with a whole tray of different types of, you know, overcooked rice and frozen banana peels and potato peels and a couple coffee filters, chunks of lettuce, thinking that this is going to be another run-of-the-mill kind of routine feeding for this system. And now I'm wondering if I've got to switch into rescue mode here to try to pull out what remaining worms are still alive in here, because it seems like if I don't, I come back in here in another few days, there's going to be none left. This is becoming ridiculous. I don't even know if there's a possible way to turn things around anymore, you know, in a system like this. Ay, ay, ay. Certainly not what I came down here expecting to do. I thought I'd be down here for just a few minutes, drop in some fresh food and make the worms happy, but at this point I got a feeling I've got a bunch of worms in here that are quite unhappy. And if I don't do something, then I might not have any worms in here at all in a short period of time. What a pain in the neck. You know, I'm not, you know, trying to come across like I'm being selfish, because, you know, I shouldn't be portraying this as a pain in the neck per se, even though it obviously is. I should be more compassionate towards the poor worms who are probably just barely hanging on due to whatever it is that's wiping them out in here. And I don't think I could really blame the mites either, you know. I think the mites are just a reaction to whatever it is that's causing the worms to die off. The worms are dying off because of something that I've not yet been able to identify. And the mites are just, as a result, being provided with pretty much a huge supply of available food, causing them to pig out and multiply and everything else. What a pain. You know, what the heck is going on in my wormery? I don't understand. All right, I got to switch gears. This is not what I had planned on doing, but I do feel like I've got to work my way through this material and try to rescue whatever worms I possibly can and get them the heck out of here. You know, I just did this a couple days ago in another of my systems. And it's a little bit time consuming, but if that's the only way I'm going to be able to save these poor worms, I might as well get to work. So I'm going to pause the camera here. I'm going to get myself something that I can collect the worms and put them into. And I guess we'll regroup once I've made a little bit of progress and I get a better handle on what I'm in for here. Joy. So now I've resorted to a system similar to what I did last time this occurred. I had moved everything over to this side, and everything that I've sifted through is over here, and you can see the number of worms I've collected. Certainly not many. But there's a worm here on the tip of my index finger that reminds me of another worm that I encountered when I was doing this recently. And it's so weird because the tip of the worm is just almost black in color, while the back end of the worm is still pretty normal in terms of its color. And I don't know, that just seems so unusual to me because it just does not look right, you know? It's almost like if it was full of very dark colored foods that it had eaten and it's just not really making its way through. It kind of reminds me of something someone mentioned where they had suspected that maybe a lack of grit was causing the worms to be unable to pass through the food that they were consuming, and that the material was kind of just jamming up within their bodies or something, or whatever the case may be. I don't know what's going on with this poor worm here, but it just looks so different from all the others that I thought I would shoot a little footage of it just so that others can see what I'm seeing here. Luckily, all the other worms that I've been able to pull out of here, and obviously it's not many, they all seem pretty lively and healthy looking. The only problem is that there's just so few of them. I mean, you can see I've probably gone through about a quarter of the material at this point, and I am now down in the middle of the bin where the last feeding was administered. And I'm finding a worm here and there, so it's you know, it's progressing, but certainly not looking very promising in terms of being able to fish out many worms from this system. So I just thought I would show that one unusual looking worm here really quick. Very, very dark in color, pretty much black at its tip, at its head. And then its color kind of fading off into a more light, normal looking color going back along its body. And it just didn't look right. So I thought I would make mention of it and show it here. So it continues. I am picking out stuff that looks like it's larger chunks of stuff like food and bedding that was not broken down, and setting it aside so that what's really getting piled up on the side here is stuff that I've picked worms out of, but I've also picked larger chunks of material out of. So my idea was just to place this stuff out into the yard somewhere so that if there's still baby worms or whatever in it that I was unable to locate, that they'd have a chance to hopefully squirm out of this material down into the earth and continue living out in the open air. So we'll see how this progresses. I'll just continue. Now, as I continue with this process, you can see that I'm now beyond the center point. So I've already kind of processed about half or maybe more than half of this material. And that means I've already passed the area where the last feeding was administered. And it was in there that I thought I might find a little bit more of a concentration of worms. But I didn't really see anything out of the ordinary as I went through that middle area. I would just keep on picking through, and I would keep finding a worm here and there and extracting them. But once again, you could see the overall collection of worms that I've managed to rescue here, and it's still not a very significant number, unfortunately. And, you know, I'm doing my best to try to break up chunks and see if I could spot anything moving. But I can't seem to help shake the feeling that a whole lot of the material that I'm sort of considering as having been checked off and examined still has worms hanging out in it. I mean, I am doing my best to sort of uncrumble bits of it and kind of stack it up and let it slide down this little slope here, and it gives me a little bit better view as far as what's in it, if anything. But you could see as I just continue doing it here in front of the camera, there's not a whole lot going on. A lot of little tiny worms, doing my best to try to snag them all. And while I'm at it, I'm also, you know, once in a while finding a cocoon and pulling that out too and including it with the extraction. But I have to imagine that there's a whole lot of that going right past me, because that just doesn't move and it's not as easy to locate and observe. And the other weird thing here was that some of these things I believe are just chunks of the towel that was placed in here. It's been in here ever since the bin started all those weeks ago. And the one weird thing is that when this bin was fed 8 days ago, I somehow recall it being a fairly generous feeding. I think there were 3 coffee filters, each with a certain amount of coffee and some veggie scraps placed into each. I think there may have even been a banana peel sprawled out across the top of the feeding area. And I thought I'd just encounter a lot more leftover food considering how few worms are in here. So it almost makes me feel like this might have just occurred within the past couple days, because it seems like the food that was in here, at least, I don't know, I could be just imagining, but it does seem like I found very little leftover food, meaning something must have eaten it. And I mean, I guess there's always that possibility that the mites just went berserk on the food, in addition to eating all the dead worms, but it almost seems like the worms were still around for a while, consuming all of the food I had given them only 8 days ago. And then whatever it is that occurred here and wiped them out must have just occurred like super rapidly and fairly recently, because there's so few worms remaining. And it must have been a pretty good sized worm population that, you know, did away with all that food that was placed in here. So here again, I'm just thinking out loud. I don't know. I just see things that don't seem to add up, and I just figure I'd share. So you can see I'm kind of making my way to the end here. There's not a whole lot left, but I'm still doing my best to be thorough. You know, while I'm at it, I keep pulling out these larger chunks of uncomposted stuff so that what remains here is in large part casting type materials. So I would like to just place it out in the yard somewhere, but I don't want to have it full of all kinds of chunks of material that's not yet broken down. So there's probably another at least 15 or 20 minutes worth of screening remaining here, so it is a little bit of a time-consuming process. But I'll continue on without the camera rolling, and we'll check back in later, maybe when I'm done here. It's kind of unusual how there seems to be a greater concentration of worms here as I kind of keep pushing things into this last corner here. I'm almost wondering if I've been corralling worms the entire time and I'm going to just end up with a large mound of worms here at the end. Seems unlikely. Just doesn't seem like the worms could have all reacted that quickly and moved that quickly through the material. But it does seem like I am finding a good number of worms all jumbled up here in this corner. Maybe this corner just kind of had something about it that was a little bit more hospitable. Less hostile to the worms. So I'm finding a few more here, but I know that I'm almost at the end, and we will have rescued a number of worms out of this material, but obviously not many, as you can see. Well, I couldn't resist, so I just upturned this corner, and it does seem like there's a lot more worms right here, nestled in this last corner that I've not yet probed through. So it does make me wonder if I've actually managed to corral all of them into this corner. And obviously it's not a lot, but still. It just makes you wonder if there was just something good about that corner and they've been there the whole while, or did I actually sort of drive them across the entire length of the bin into this corner where I'm finally looking through the last of the material. There's definitely a higher concentrations of worms in this last batch of material that I just sort of upturned. And who knows, maybe I did sort of drive them into it. But yeah, certainly not a lot. So we're almost done here. Not much left to do. Well, that's it. I made my way all the way through, and what we're left with here is a relatively small little mound of worms that have... I'm going to treat this as being rescued. Hopefully there's nothing wrong with these worms that's going to cause them to die anyway. My hope is that it's just something in the material that's causing the material to go haywire. And then, I don't know, I really have no good explanation for what's going on here. Unfortunately, even though I've demonstrated something similar to this in other bins of mine, no one else has really provided any insights into what I'm seeing here either. So just little clues here and there, and nothing that it seems any of us can really put our fingers on in terms of what's causing this. This material is not quite as muddy and clumpy and nasty as the stuff we saw in the other systems where we saw major die outs. So there's a certain degree of inconsistency going on here too. I mean, I don't remember if this stuff was this bad last week. I'm going to definitely check out the video from the last time I checked in on this bin 8 days ago. See if I can at least draw some sort of conclusions as to how it looked then and how it looks now. See if there's anything that might have been sort of a telltale or an indicator back then of something going bad. So I've got some worms here, and I think I'm simply going to release them into the same system that I released the other worms that I recently rescued. And then I'm still left with another bin that I had planned to feed today. This one doesn't get the food that I had intended to give it, obviously. I'm just going to take it outside. And I guess we'll try to get back to feeding the bin that the other bin that I came down here to feed originally. And then we'll go ahead and we'll release the worms into that other migration bin. And then this stuff is just going to go outside. I guess the last little stir of the material revealed 1 or 2 more worms. And I'm sure there's many, many more in here that I missed. So whatever ones I missed, along with all the cocoons that are still scattered in here as well, of which there are probably very many. Because almost everywhere I look I see a cocoon. And I'll try to fetch it when I do, but at this point I think that this is just a kind of another lost cause bin, unfortunately. So I'm heading outside with this material. There's still one other bin that I want to feed with this food I bought down here, and then we'll let these little guys loose into the other migration system. So I'll return in a little while. We can pick up where we left off. Well, I've taken the other system outside, or the other bin full of whatever at this point, outside, as well as that collection of stuff that I separated from the material, the stuff that seems like it was just not broken down stuff. The not broken down stuff I placed into my compost barrel outside, kind of hoping that it wasn't, you know, going to carry with it some sort of a disease that's going to wipe out whatever's living in that system. But that system's, I believe, is pretty diverse in terms of the stuff that's living out there. So I think if anything intrusive tries to make its way in there or take a foothold, I'd like to think that it has the ability to fend off anything like that and protect itself as far as an environment goes. So we've had this end of it over here covered with plastic to try to keep circulation of moisture happening and keep things nice and damp over there. And it seems to be working well. Out here, with only just that sheet of paper covering stuff, things have been left to dry a little bit more. It's definitely dry. It also looks like we've got a good number of little flying insects that have made themselves at home in here too. I think besides releasing worms into here, I think we should just do a quick inspection just to see if anything is of concern. I think last time we were in here, which was only a few days ago, when we reinforced the feeding zone with a little bit more food, we had done this already and looked through here and saw worms throughout the material. The worms that we encountered seemed to be doing okay. That seems to be the case here as well. This is the bin that's got the variety of different types of worms in it. This is, as I understand it, it's a mix of red wigglers and Indian blue worms and European night crawlers. I'm assuming these big fat ones are the European night crawlers. So I just figured as long as we're coming in here, why don't we just take this as another opportunity to stir up some of the more damp material on the bottom, bring it up high, give it a chance to dry a little bit, and at the same time move some of the more dry stuff that's been out on the surface for a few days drying, get that stuff down low. Just based on what I'm seeing here, the worms seem okay. The material is drying and becoming more crumbly as time goes on. But it is still very kind of worked material, you know. A lot of people's bins, when you look at the material, it's a lot more flowing. But it also seems to have, I don't know, some maybe more bedding mixed into it. So maybe it's not pure castings, it's more of like a mix, but maybe it's a mistake, but on my part, I'll usually try to drive towards almost entirely broken down material in my bins before I start to strive towards migrating the worms out of the material. I'm also wondering if this might also be a good chance to introduce some of the neem cake into here. I don't recall if this system received any. I don't think it did. And maybe by adding some, we can help it kind of kick some pests if there's any mites or anything living in here. I don't know, maybe we did add some. Now that I'm kind of tilling this stuff and I'm smelling it, it does actually smell like we probably placed some neem cake into here. Because this stuff has this kind of oniony scent to it. However, yeah, I think that's what it was. I think I had placed some into the feeding area here, but we did not place anything elsewhere. So maybe the feeding area is already treated with the neem cake, so that if mites do try to wander in there, they'll hopefully be sort of affected by it. I think the effect is that they'll eat the stuff and then they'll be unable to reproduce. So that generation of mites that's actually exposed to the neem cake survives and lives just fine, but it's their it's what would have been their offspring is what's prevented. So I'm wondering if it might be a good idea just to throw a little bit more of that stuff in here. The bedding in here, the food supply, everything looks like it's still holding up pretty good here. You know, I'm only questioning whether I might want to beef up the food and bedding in here one more time, is because I am, you know, equipped with a little bit of a surplus of material here that I want to try to do away with without overfeeding that bin that we're going to feed next. So maybe we will just place in some bedding and half of this food and just use that as yet another reinforcement for this feeding area. And then we'll throw in a little bit of neem cake. How does that sound? Over here on the side, I've got some leafy material that I'm going to just drop in here on the far edge as sort of the foundation for this addition of food. Here I've got this rice that kind of got burnt onto the bottom of the pot, and after soaking it's loosened up enough that I was able to scrape it out of the bottom of the pot. But rather than chucking it, I figured I would feed it to worms. This banana peel should be something that the worms are going to be tempted by and drawn to, hopefully, as well as some of these chunks of really spoiled lettuce. I guess we'll save what remains for that other bin that we're going to feed, that we came down here to feed originally, which would have been fed by now, hours ago, if it wasn't for this little saga that's going on here in my wormery with seemingly never-ending issues. I don't know what's going on, but hopefully I can at some point figure out what's happening here. So let's break out this package of the neem cake here. I'm going to place some of it into this little cup here. And by doing so, I think it's just going to give me a little bit more dexterity in terms of being able to spread it a little bit more carefully and more precisely. So we'll just cover up this feeding area so that it can continue the way it's been going. And it does look like it's, you know, managing to get a whole bunch of worms to come over to it and hang out, but there's still quite a ways to go in terms of this material out here being depopulated. So my idea here was that in addition to there being neem cake over in the feeding area, now there's also going to be some neem cake spread out across the top of this bin too, so that mites hopefully as a result get minimized or eliminated. And since this stuff supposedly is a treat for the worms too, the worms can help themselves to it as well. Okay, and then before we close up shop here, let's go ahead and release these little guys into here. And hopefully they're not bringing with them some sort of a nasty pathogen that's going to wreak havoc in here. This is the bin into which I released that last batch of rescued worms out of the other system that seemed to take a nosedive and crash. So we've already had two small populations of rescued worms out of 2 trashed systems that we've released into this bin. And at some point soon, hopefully we'll be able to get all the worms out of here and relocated. And then this bin will be history too. So, I don't know. It's a little bit taxing. I usually like to think that my channel is meant to be an example of how easy vermicomposting can be. I always try to keep it really simple and straightforward. I always try to use very, you know, easily attainable materials, stuff that doesn't cost anything basically, stuff that is just around the house anyway. I try not to come across like it's a pain in the neck sort of a hobby, because it isn't. It's a lot of fun, and you do also kind of have that benefit of feeling like you're doing a good positive thing by not dumping your kitchen scraps and waste paper and whatnot into the trash. You're actually, you know, recycling it in a responsible fashion. But it just feels like lately I've been having such lousy luck in my bins. Hope I'm not turning anyone off from the whole idea of vermicomposting. All right, let's get this final feeding of this material to that bin that I had intended to feed taken care of, and then we'll be finished here. All right, so hopefully this, hopefully the feeding of this system will be a lot more normal and, you know, in line with what I came down here to do originally. So the first bin that we had intended to feed just did not go well. And I mean, this doesn't look so good either, I gotta say. I mean, I'm seeing signs of dead worms here, and right away on the surface too, you could see a number of worms. And the I mean, some of the worms out on the surface seem like they've just come up here to have a drink of water and that they're okay, I hope. But other ones look like they're just trashed. And there's a little bit of an odor coming out of here. Over there too. Gosh. I got a feeling it might be time to just start removing the plastic coverings from all my systems. It might have been a good idea in the very dry winter months, when the air is extremely dry from the heater always running, and you know, that dry air sucking moisture out of my bins along the side of the openings on the edge of the bins and stuff like that. But now that the heat's not running so much, it's springtime, I think that these bins are just far more capable of hanging on to the moisture that's within them now than they were during the winter. And that maybe keeping these plastic coverings is kind of causing a little bit too much moisture in here. A little bit of an imbalance from the perspective of you know, how much moisture would be optimal. I mean, there is a good number of dead worms in here, but hopefully we're not looking at another die out here. I'm definitely not putting the plastic coverings back on. And if there's dead worms in here that need to be cleaned up by mites, I'm kind of hoping that there's adequate number of mites in here to take care of that job. But I am going to be including a neem cake here too to try to limit the number of mites that are in the system. Material just is a little bit overly damp, and it's got that kind of weird, kind of dry feeling to it, you know, like it looks all damp and muddy, but it's feels almost dry. Look at that, it's not even hardly sticking to my glove. And it keeps taking me back to that little story somebody mentioned in the comments of my video once not long ago about some sort of a bacteria that can get into the bin and suck up all the moisture that's in the bin and make things very unhealthy. You know, the other thing that might be in here that's or missing from being in here that could also be a problem is maybe insufficient bedding. Although, you know, you look around and you can see scraps of leaves, leaf stems, but maybe the leafy parts of the leaves have all been consumed as food, and maybe there just isn't as much bedding in here as I think. It might just be a little bit deceiving by seeing all of these leaf stems. So I'm trying to think about what I can maybe do in here to turn things around, because it just doesn't look as healthy as it could have been, or as healthy as it was, you know, even about a week ago when we last checked in. I certainly don't remember things looking so flaky in here. Very weird. I don't know, man. Just feels like there's just something going on around here. I just haven't been able to put my finger on it. And the poor worms in my systems are all the ones having to deal with the fallout. So there's clearly leftover foods in here, you know, banana peel, stems, chunks of bedding, pieces of paper, all kinds of this and that. But I'm starting to feel like I could maybe still recover in here if I possibly maybe even go a little bit crazy with the bedding. If I take a lot of these little tiny leaves that I showed earlier, I actually went the extra mile to try to sift this stuff down to the point where there's virtually no leaf stems in it. And hopefully, maybe if we just, you know, stir a whole bunch of that stuff up into here, it'll provide the bin with a little bit more of a bedding boost, which might be part of the problem. Maybe there's just not enough bedding going on in here. I mean, every time I look around, I could see chunks of, you know, little white specks everywhere. I'm thinking that's the eggshell that I usually include as bedding in my feedings. So I feel like there's probably sufficient grit in here. So I don't know if I need to add grit on this go around, but I'm wondering if I should, just as sort of a precautionary measure, because I mean, if I lose this system here, then the only red wigglers I have remaining are the ones that are in that migration that we just checked in on. And in that system, it's not even pure red wigglers, it's a mix. So I really do want to, you know, make sure I've got at least one system of each type of worm that I know is sort of a pure batch of only that type of worm. So I'm starting to become a little bit panicky here that I've somehow killed off all of my red wigglers somehow. So number one, I'm going in here with a whole bunch of bedding, I think. And I wouldn't want this stuff to like suck up all the moisture in the system either, so I think I might as well include a little bit of moisture in here too, in the form of just spray down with my bottle. So I think I'll just give each application of leaves a little bit of a squirt. And I can only hope that what I'm doing here is going to help this bin recover. Because it certainly seems like it's preparing to take a nosedive, just like my other systems have done. I'm really glad that I've got this stuff on hand to, utilize this way. And I certainly hope it is the key to solving the problems in this system. Let's see if we can check out how things look on this edge. Very, very weird. I'm at a total loss as to what the heck is happening here. And I mean, I wish I could just point at it and say, oh, what's going on here is clearly X, Y, and Z, and make sure you do this or don't do that. And I wish I knew what the answer was to try to turn it around. So I'm not suggesting that what I'm doing here is necessarily the solution. I'm just sort of incorporating a lot of the thinking that has been kicked around in the comments lately on my videos, where I've been troubleshooting various issues, including stuff that seems to resemble what we're seeing here, and hoping for the best. Really weird and a little bit unsettling at the same time. Hope I'm not going overboard with this stuff here. Hopefully I'm applying enough moisture while I'm working this stuff in to make sure that it doesn't end up becoming like a big chunk of dry concrete by sucking up whatever remaining moisture is in this bin. Because the other thing I was worried about was having that plastic cover on top. My thought was to leave this covered with only a piece of paper, and that's probably a good idea, since it is mostly castings. Its ability to hang on to whatever moisture is in here should be pretty good, despite the fact that I'm stirring in a bunch of fairly dry material. I also feel like I should probably be applying some of this neem cake too, as long as I'm kind of busy stirring here. And I think with this stuff too, I'm going to be pretty generous, so I'm just going to lay in a heap of it down the middle, and then we'll stir that in as well. Maybe combine with a little bit more leafy material. Naturally, if you're watching this and you've got any ideas, I would love to hear everyone's thoughts as far as what I'm doing right, what I'm doing wrong. This is something of a departure from the norm down here in my systems. A lot of times I just feel like I've got really good fortune in my worm bins. Things seem to, hum along quite nicely. But for whatever reason, it just seems like things have gone a little bit haywire lately. And I can only hope that I'm able to sort of nip it in the bud and stop it from happening at some point soon, before it wipes out my entire wormery. Starting to feel like I've almost emptied an entire bottle into here already. But it also seems like we've added a good amount of dry leafy material too, so I can only hope that there's some sort of a balance in between the two. So I still feel like I'm going to proceed with the original plan of administering the feeding that I was going to put in here. So we'll open up a crevice down the middle. I've got some paper off here on the side that I want to get rid of and make use of. A lot of this stuff had just been kind of top coverings on some of my bins and serving various purposes in different places. But if a little bit more bedding is the key here, then it can only help, I believe. Here too, this coffee filter will also serve as a boost to the bedding in here. We'll just try to spread all this stuff out across this feeding area. Chunks of lettuce, chunks of potato peel, some banana peel, a variety of different food items in here. Oops, I guess that's it for this glove too. So why don't we just take what remains of this little bit of grit that I've got left in here and include it with the feeding. I've got a larger container of it from when I just processed a whole bunch of eggshells. So we'll go ahead and we'll mix in some grit, not knowing what the heck is going to help things here. And at this point, what else do we have? We'll get rid of the last of this coffee. And then maybe what we can do at the very end here is cover up with a sprinkling of maybe just a little bit more leafy material across the top. Just feels to me like I'm adding so much dry material here. I really hope I'm not kind of, you know, going to cause some sort of a major dry out of the material in this bin. I guess maybe I can just try to add a little bit more dampness across the top here. So I think we're pretty much done here. I definitely ended up getting a lot more than I bargained for when I came down here originally with that food, thinking I'm coming down here to feed a couple fairly happy, healthy systems. But it seems like I've just got more of the same going on in yet another couple of my bins, and hopefully we didn't get in here too late to try to prevent it from happening. But so far I just haven't had a great deal of luck, so I really hope we're not in for yet another dead bin. Just checking to make sure that there's not any more stranded worms stuck on the plastic covering that was on top of this system here. You know, before we finish, why don't we I believe that the NEEM cake, from what I understand, also has the effect of helping you deal with the flying insects too. And I'm noticing a good number of flying insects that have seemingly made their way into here too. So if it's going to help with getting rid of them too, then I'm going to go ahead and spread some of it out here. I'm almost wondering if a little sprinkling of diatomaceous earth might also help. But I almost feel like I'm in desperation just trying anything that I can grasp at this point, because this just doesn't feel like a, you know, a surgical kind of targeted strike against a known enemy. It just feels like I'm taking shots in the dark, and I'm just kind of hoping that I come out of this without another major casualty on my hands. So, alright, we're going to use this paper to cover up with. We're not going to allow for ongoing drying of the material. Hopefully the material has the ability to just hang on to what moisture it's got down below, and that it's sufficient, and that the bedding we mixed in doesn't dry it out too much. And then at this point, the best we can do, I guess, is hope for the best. I really don't know what to expect. Alright everyone, well, if you're still here watching, thanks so much for sticking it out with me and watching to the end. If you enjoyed the video, or at least if you sympathize with my situation, remember to leave me a quick thumbs up. That's really appreciated. Also consider subscribing to the channel too if you haven't done so already. Alright everyone, have a great day. Bye now.